few days.
And
so when they told me that you were coming, I said I should have known before.
Anyhow, you are here, and that is good news. Thank you.
Yeah.
But my only problem is that I have to leave because I have a lecture starting in the academic hour 10:15, right, which you know of over here in Sweden. But I wanted to. But
उर्दू में कहते हैं कि आपका दीदार ही होगा. It's called दीदार. You show your face everywhere.
No. I wanted to be here because we take this series very seriously. Anyway, so shall we get started?
Yes.
Sir, we will be starting next 30 seconds. The webinar will go live.
Okay.
Rohit?
Yep. Yeah.
You know the details, so.
Yeah. Do you want to? I will introduce you, and then if you want to say a few things.
No. I can start in 30 seconds. Just let me know when to start.
Yeah. Okay. I think Sarthak is still online, so he will just give us the go ahead.
It's live.
It's live. SG, it's live.
There is an echo at your end. I don't know why, but anyhow.
Can we get echo?
Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon to the people in India, and good morning to Professor Ahmed. This is the first lecture in a series that we are, sort of starting up in the School of Liberal Studies, which itself is a new school. And therefore, I'm delighted that we have as our first speaker in the series, Ishtiaq Ahmed, Emeritus Professor at Stockholm University. It is a great honor and privilege for us to have him inaugurate this series. The SOLS was set up, or the School of Liberal Studies was set up with a very particular philosophy in mind, both in pedagogy as well as in what we are going to do, or what we plan to do, how we plan to train our young minds. Now, when we were growing up, we looked at our teachers as repositories of knowledge and for wisdom. Now, as teachers, we have realized that we are no longer repositories of knowledge because that's all available in Google. It's all available on the net. So the only thing we can really impart to the students, if at all, is our wisdom, understanding, and insight, and really facilitate their young minds to think for themselves. Because most of what we have experienced will not be repeated in the new society that is coming up, which will have new experiences, new setups, because everything is changing, not just within nations, but also between nations, globally as well as locally. The entire structure of society is changing thanks to the technological revolutions that are taking place. And hence, the best thing that we can do as teachers is to encourage the young minds to think for themselves. And one way of thinking for themselves is, of course, to practice oneself in listening to different perspectives, looking at different ways, the same things, and encouraging people to discuss among themselves. So discourse is of the essence in the coming future. And it is with those things in mind that we have started this series where we intend to bring in thoughtful minds from across the globe to address our scholars, as well as our young faculty, because we, as you can see in the audience, we have a bunch of very, very young faculty members and who are out to, set themselves up on a completely new path of pedagogy and research. With these few words, I would like to once again thank Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed for agreeing to interact with us. And I seriously think that this exchange of ideas will lead to collaborative research. And we would love to have Professor Ahmed be engaged with us, not just in this lecture, but also in the future. With those few words, I'll hand it over to Rohit to kick off lecture.
Thank you, SG. I think SG has already done part of the honors, but I'll still talk about our speaker today, Professor Ahmed. I think he needs no introduction to this audience here. But again, as the protocol calls for it. Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed is a Swedish political scientist. He's also emeritus professor at Stockholm University. He has authored numerous books. I just mention two of his most canonical works, which is Pakistan, the Garrison State, Origins, Evolution, Consequences, 1947 to 2011. And the most recent one, which has sort of created shockwaves in both political science and history academia, which is Jinnah, His Successes, Failures, and Role in History. Professor Ahmed is also an honorary senior fellow of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, at the National University of Singapore, where he was also visiting research professor. He's also the editor-in-general of the Liberal Arts and Social Sciences International Journal. So without further ado, would everybody gathered here join me in welcoming Professor Ahmed and raising the occasion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gangopadhyay, Rohit, Roy, and colleagues sitting there. Not so many, but it's very heartening that because of, this is the unintended consequences of many things. Like COVID was a devastation in one sense, but it taught us to survive in a different way. And this webinar thing is an amazing transportation from one continent to another. And I think many barriers have been broken. So Professor Gangopadhyay, what he was saying is that these are the new times. When I was doing my research, we used to have a typewriter. Then came the first computers on which you could only type about 12 pages, save them on a cassette, and then continue. And now imagine, with all these fantastic changes taking place, it's still quite amazing that human beings remain so stuck to the past and to superstitions and religious madness. All for that, all these things are so frustrating for the seeking mind, for the inquiring mind. So I'm very glad to have this privilege of being the first to speak to this liberal school at Dehradun. Actually, Dehradun has conferred me a great honor because the value of words, cultural and literary association granted me the best English nonfiction book award for the Jinnah book. So connecting with Dehradun once again is an amazing feeling of happiness. Thank you very much, all of you. The two-nation theory, the road to statehood and their consequences. Well, insofar as the two-nation theory is concerned, it's always a case of the blame game. Who should we identify first as the villain of the piece? And so people can build their cases once they have identified the main villain and then trace the history of the two-nation theory. I have, in my research, always argued that although the chronology of events are most important, we have to look at the circumstances in which ideas like the two-nation theory could emerge and stay on and finally culminate with the partition of India. And I think to scholars sitting here in the audience, it's not at all surprising that once the Mughal Empire had been defeated, the Marathas too have been defeated, and the British had taken over, it was a very different world for people who for a long time had known either Hindu rulers or Muslim rulers, and in the case of Punjab, for a short while, even Sikh rule. Afghans would come and the invasions. So that was one part of the story. With the British taking over, I think many aspirations got a chance to be expressed, as well as apprehensions. So, for example, how did the early proponents of the two-nation theory look upon the British? That's a very interesting question to begin with. We all know that Sir Syed who was often mentioned as the first to take up this issue, divide India into Hindus and Muslims, at one stage has even said that Hindus and Muslims are two beautiful eyes of damsel India, in one of his poetic moods. But later on, undoubtedly, he became a very consistent supporter of Hindus and Muslims having different destinies. But if you look at already in his formative phase, Asbab-e Bagawat-e Hind, it's available both in the Urdu text as well as the English translation. He critiques the British for many mistakes they did, in interfering with local customs and practices and beliefs and so on, including introducing education to Muslim girls, women. But his greatest criticism is that by including Hindus and Muslims in the same units of the army, you enable them to develop fraternal relations. They even started cooking in the same place. And once you work together, you develop friendships, and it's like a brotherhood emerges. And he said, this was the biggest folly of the British, to make possible Hindus and Muslims to develop a sense of common identification as Indians. And of course, the classical case was that when the Bengal and the Bihar armies, those who revolted first, coming to Meerut and all, it's Bahadur Shah Zafar that they proclaimed as their sovereign, as against the expanding East India Company. So what he was saying was indicative of how things were happening at that point. This may be interesting to note that this lesson taught by Sir Syed became an article of faith of the British military establishment. At the level of officers, they would let Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians all associate and so on. But the units were more or less purely Sikh, or Sikh and Hindu sometimes, and purely Muslim. So at the level of the troops, they were kept apart. And that served the British very well till the very end. Now, Sir Syed then, I think it's two things which impelled him to go in this direction of the two-nation theory. One was that in the UP, state languages of UP. This was not liked at all by Sir Syed and the Muslim aristocracy, who were the main losers besides the Mughals, the royalty and so on. It was the Muslim aristocracy of northern India who had a very privileged position during Muslim rule. There is no doubt. I've quoted one Dr. Noreen Talha, where she says that about 86% of the services in the Mughal empire or state were with Muslims, of which 71% or more were with the Ashrafiya. Who are the Ashrafiya? Ashrafiya are those Muslims who could trace their descent to foreign forebears. Turks, Mughals, Pathans, the Arab Sayyids, whatever you want to call them. And, there was another category, Pathan, Mughal, and so on. Anyhow, they considered themselves an ethnic group apart from the rest. Most Muslims were converted from Hindu stock, they could be middle class, they could be lower class, they could be sometimes even upper class, caste. But in the general understanding, the Ashrafiya looked down upon converts from Indian Hindu stock, if you want to call it. So Sir Syed then became a strong opponent of this rising demand for Hindi. Simultaneously, when the Indian National Congress was formed, he thought that it was going to be the emergence of Hindu power, because already because of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the Hindu middle classes, upper castes, you want to call them, had taken to education much earlier than the Muslims. The Muslims were in a negative state of mind. Now that's about 1857, 58 onwards, the changes in Sir Syed. But a friend of mine, a Bengali actually, Professor Partha Ghosh, wrote an article recently which he sent to me, where he identifies almost at the same time a very strong, virulent anti-Muslim Bengali nationalism or Hindu nationalism. Let me read. Partha Ghosh writes, in 1858, just a year after the Hindu-Muslim joint revolt had rocked British rule in India, that Tarincharan Chattopadhyay wrote his Bharat Barshar Ithas, the first virtual anti-Muslim manifesto. Everything wrong in India was attributed to the 1,000 years of Muslim domination. The book explained the misfortunes and decline of this country began on the day the Yavana, that is Muslim flag, entered the territory of Bengal, ravaged by endless waves of oppression. The people of Bengal became disabled and timid. The country was reduced to such a state that the wealth of the prosperous, the honor of the genteel, and the chastity of the virtuous Hindu women were in great peril. The resumption of good fortune was initiated on the day the British flag was first planted on this land. It must be loudly declared that it is to bless us that Ishvara, that is God, has brought the English to this country. Now we already know that Sir Syed also saw the future of the Muslims of India, or the Ashrafiya Muslims, by collaborating with the British. So from both proponents of the two-nation theory, the British were saviors. And that's how I think the two-nation theory must be seen. Not only as a dispute, conflict, whatever you want to call it, between Hindus and Muslims, but also with the British in between them, playing one against the other depending on the circumstances. Now we all know we can move forward, and I can tell you that if we are to look at the short history of how this later on developed, then among Hindus, there were many who argued that the Muslims should be pushed west of the Indus River, and those who remain in India should be reconverted to Hinduism. There were many theories. There is a scholar called Jones, whose work I have quoted in my book on the partition of Punjab. Actually, my greatest work, if in terms of creative methodological changes and so on, is the partition of Punjab, the Punjab bloodied, partition and cleansed, where I give this background. So this was the view of some Hindus already in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. Then among Muslims, there was the hope of recreating an Islamic state. Like one can say Shah Waliullah, he invited the ruler of Afghanistan to come and help the Muslims of India fight the Marathas who were expanding into northern India. And then we have several others on the way. In 1888, I think, Maulvi Muharram Ali Chishti, who had a newspaper in Paisa Akhbar Lahore, he wrote articles justifying the partition of India to create an Islamic Pakistan. So these ideas were tossed around from both sides as we go along. We'll now come into the 19th century, and then we find that Bhai Parmanand of Multan, Punjabi, he wrote several articles, I think, in the Tribune, also suggesting that the river Indus be the border, and Muslims should be on the western side of that, of the banks of the Indus, and the rest should be India. At about the same time, then there are Muslims like the Kheri brothers of Delhi, two brothers who came to Stockholm, where I live now, and where Professor Ganga Poide is probably present at the moment, in 1917 to attend the International Socialist Conference, where he proposed the creation of a socialist Islamic state in northern India. So these ideas were there being presented all the time. And in between, we find that the British in 1906, accepting a delegation of Muslims, upper class Muslims, led by the Aga Khan, who met the Viceroy, Lord Minto, at Shimla, and the Shimla deputation presented demands that the Muslims be granted separate electorates and even weightage, that is more representation than the numbers. And in 1909, this demand was granted. Many of us believe that this constitutional, reform for all times to come created the scope or the space for Muslims to just connect with Muslims in order to defend their interest, promote their interest, whatever you want to call it. Whereas the main Indian consciousness, in which there were Hindus predominantly, but also Muslims, I think even Sikhs were attracted to the idea that we all Indians liberate India from British rule and become a free people. So with the Indian National Congress then initially petitioning our party, then with Mahatma Gandhi returning from South Africa, radicalizing it, making it a mass party, things began to change very rapidly. And the two-nation theory then was around, but in the mainstream, I think it was the Indian National Congress which attracted attention of most people. Of course, there was a Hindu majority, the Muslims are only 25%, but still you had from day one leading Muslim scholars, individuals, even parties supporting the Indian National Congress. Like, for example, the Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Hind of the Deoband was part of it. Abdul Ghaffar Khan entered in the 1920s. We had from Sindh, Allah Bakhsh Somru, a leader who, until his assassination in 1943, strongly believed in a united India of all communities. And of course, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who can forget his services in advocating that Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, all can live together in a united India. But the Muslim League, which was founded in 1906, remained a communal party interested only in communitarian questions. And this continues till about, let's say, 1935, 36, 37. And I've called that period when Jinnah was already a leader, but having left the Congress in 1920, because he didn't like mass action, He was in the wilderness for a while, but then mostly he was supporting an idea that India was not one nation, but multiple nationalities. And among nationalities, he would include Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Dalits, and the Dravidian people of the South. This is sometimes the nationalities he mentioned. And the argument was that since India is not one nation, there is no need for a strong center ruling over the rest of India. The center should only take care of essential things like defense and foreign affairs and maybe communications. The rest should be given, all residual powers should belong to the provinces, which the Congress found unacceptable, especially with radicals like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose and others emerging as the new type of leaders who were looking beyond self-rule and so on. So the Nehru report, I have argued, was the first declaration of what the Congress wanted as a free India for all, which says that there will be no state religion, men and women will have equal rights, and separate electorates would become redundant if universal adult franchise is introduced. And another argument was that the Muslims were not a minority in the minority sense. They were well represented in 2 regions of India, had their own chief ministers and so on. The real minorities were people who were just 1 or 2%. And so separate electorates only prevents Indian consciousness from developing. And I put on record even British, officers writing that for us it is good that separate electorates are maintained because then the Muslims become our friends. I have quoted this in the Jinnah book. So this is how the triangle, I think, was moving until the 1935 Act is introduced. From a very limited electorate, it is expanded to about 10-11%. 10-11% is still a narrow electorate. But I think about 35 million people suddenly got the right to vote. People of property who paid revenue or had a level of education, those people got the right to vote. And the 1935 Act was still India within the British Empire. There was no question of the British granting it freedom, united or divided. In the elections which took place, both the Muslim League, which was a communal party just for the Muslims, as well as the Indian National Congress, which was open to all, if you look at their manifestos, they are more or less the same. Only that the Muslim League is for a weak center and the Congress wants an effective center. And then while the Congress speaks for all Indians, the Muslim League talks about Muslim interests. Those differences are there, but in terms of social questions and so on, there weren't many differences. Although in 1936, in his presidential address at Lucknow, Jawaharlal Nehru had said that we will abolish zimidari, that is big landlordism, as well as recast India in the light of the Soviet experiment of development. So this idea that India would be not only without zimidari, but may become another Soviet Union type of socialist country, I think not only frightened the landowners, especially the Muslims, who could then opt out if an opportunity existed. The princes, the princely states, how many? I think 565 or 64. But also the British. The British never ever wanted India to be attractive to Soviet communism. Actually, from 1833 onwards, the great game was to keep the Russians in Central Asia and never let them come to South Asia. Imagine the same Russians now armed with an international ideology, expansive ideology called communism. So many, I think the alarm bells rang already in 1936. 37 is the election. The Congress sweeps in the Hindu majority provinces. The Muslim League is routed in the Muslim majority provinces. In Punjab, where I think there were 75 seats reserved for Muslims, the Muslim League could win only 2. The party which won most seats was the Punjab Unionist Party. The Punjab Unionist Party was a intercommunal party with Hindus, Muslims, and the Sikhs from the outside supporting it. For example, the main leader was Sir Fazle Hussain, but his next man was Sir Chotu Ram, a Hindu Jat from Haryana. And this sort of setup remained till 1947. So it wasn't a communal party. In Sindh, it was Allah Baksh Sumru's Ittihad Party. Ittihad means unity party, which swept the elections. The Muslim League didn't win a single seat. In the Northwest Frontier Province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Khudai Khidmatgar of Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his brother Dr. Khan were already Congress allies. So there also the Muslim League got no seat at all. In Bengal, out of 84 reserved seats, the Muslim League, I think, won 40, and 44 were won by the Krishak Shramik Party. I mean, this is the exact name I keep forgetting, but the leader was, Qazi Fazlul Haq. He was the leader. So, whereas in the Muslim minority provinces, where the Hindus were in a majority, the Muslim League did fairly well, but not very impressively. Now, there is a problem which I don't know how to resolve. The older literature suggests that there was some understanding between Muslim Leaguers and the Congress in the UP that whatever the result of the election, we will form a coalition government. But when the results showed that the Muslim League had no support among Muslims, the Congress decided that they couldn't maintain that understanding. Of course, I know very reputable Indian historians denying any such understanding. But I have given the whole discussion, those who deny and those who think that something of the sort did exist. But anyhow, in my new book, which is coming in a year's time, hopefully, which is on the partition of India, Punjab and Bengal, just looking at the partition, not going so much back in time and who did what and so on, but just what was the positioning of different parties and what happened. There I'm going to quote Jinnah from 1935 that, look, we wanted to form coalition governments, but the Congress refused. So whether there was an understanding or not, Jinnah is on record saying that we did want to form coalition governments, but we were ignored. That's the turning point for Jinnah. He then goes around warning Muslim landlords that if India becomes free, united under Congress rule, that's the end of your big land holdings and your local influence and so on. So let the Muslim League be your party at the national level to negotiate, the future of India with the British and with the Indian National Congress. These were the principal parties. Now we move towards what is called the next, the road to statehood. How these ideas now become the basis of a political movement which culminates towards statehood, not India united, but India partitioned and divided, and two, dominions, later on republics, and so on. And I say that Jinnah, I quote, telling the governor of Bombay that from henceforth I'll use communalism. That is, tell Muslims that you are a different people, different nation, and that they had nothing in common with Hindus. And I show that Jinnah from at least January or March 1940, January 1940 onwards, can never again be heard mentioning even remotely that he wants some sort of peace, power sharing deal with the Indian National Congress in a united India. I know there is a book by Aisha Jalal claiming it, but I've shown that she has simply ignored the hundreds of speeches, statements of Jinnah, which fly in the face of such a thesis. The day, let's say 22nd of March, when he delivered the presidential address at Lahore, at the annual session of the Muslim League, the whole speech I've quoted and analyzed as well. It emphasizes all the differences between Hindus and Muslims. That they have nothing in common. They don't marry, they don't eat together, they can't drink water from the same vessel, and the caste system and so on. All those things which were already part of the social, cultural problem existing in society were now politicized to argue that the only way you can prevent a civil war in India is to partition India, give a part of India to Muslims and a part of India to Hindus. And he said that we are giving 3/4 of India to the Hindus. Why are they not willing to give us 1/4 of it? So that's his argument. And then he sort of unflinchingly, relentlessly, from morning to evening, anytime you talk to him, and he's very clear, we want India partitioned because Hindus and Muslims have nothing in common. The Muslims are a political nation by virtue of the Islamic faith. They have their own idea of what is law, constitution, the rights of individuals, the rights of women, and so on and so forth. So such a nation is entitled under the right of self-determination to a separate state. Now the question is, why did the Congress fail to confront the Muslim League? And I would say that there are two things, omissions and commissions. The Congress is guilty of both. For example, the omission is, we can call it a commission as well, that when the Second World War broke out, Mahatma Gandhi went and met Viceroy Lord Linlithgow and expressed sympathy, but this was not liked by the Congress leadership. And they said, unless you transfer power to us, and the argument theoretically is very interesting, that you say that you are fighting German fascism for freedom, but how can an enslaved people fight for your freedom unless they are free themselves? So the argument, intellectually speaking, is very accurate. But did it fit into the balance of power, the demographic structure, the way the state services were already structured? Muslims were overrepresented in the army. Although 25% of the population, they were anywhere between 38 to 42%, depending which year we are talking about. Dr. Ambedkar even mentions in his book on Pakistan that 70% of the army is Muslim, which was never true at any stage. It was always less than 42% has been the highest, but 36, 38 has been the normal strength of the Muslims in the British Indian Army. Anyhow, also in the police, the Muslims were overrepresented. This is the classic way for an imperial power to maintain law and order by having more minorities on their side. to keep the majority in control. This happens everywhere. I mean, if you look at the world, how the French dealt with the Middle East and all, I've shown it. Minorities become important for the imperial power to do their game. Anyhow, so when that happens, Jinnah goes and offers his services to Viceroy Linlithgow, but demands that the British make a commitment that at the end of the war, the Muslims will be granted the right of self-determination, which, by the way, Linlithgow never did, or probably could not, because at that time, the British were not even willing to give India a dominion status. I've quoted in 1943, when the second last Viceroy, Lord Wavell, came, Linlithgow, who was leaving now after having crushed the Quit India movement, told him that we are here for another 30 years. That means 1973, and then they would have considered whether they wanted to leave India. Why they couldn't, we know. The Second World War, destroyed their economy, put them under great debt to the Americans, and the American pressure then forced. We come to that later, maybe in the questions or as I wind up. So what I'm saying is, and Jinnah himself is on record saying, until now it was Mr. Jinnah, Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi. Now they are laying the red carpet for me. And Linlithgow says that in the promotion of Jinnah, I had a personal stake. So on both sides, it is recognized that they need each other to confront the Indian National Congress. The Congress then commits another major blunder, I think, of which maybe some of you may find this controversial, but the fact is that Subhash Chandra Bose, already before he left for Russia and then for Germany and Japan, wanted an armed uprising, which the Congress knew that it was too much adventurous. But the pressure created by Subhash Chandra Bose and many other radicals was so much that finally, in August 1942, the Congress announces Quit India, that the British should leave and Indians should take over. Now, the truth is that Linlithgow could use his whip and use it very effectively. Thousands of people were arrested, whipped. I think many were executed, but they crushed the Quit India movement. The Muslim League kept away from it, and there were many many conservative, propertied Hindus who were also opposed to the Quit India movement. This is all on record. So the Congress misadventure with the Quit India movement put it in jail from August 1942 till June 1945. Now, this was like leaving the field entirely to the Muslim League and to the British to promote it. So during this period, the message of the Muslim League was that in a united India, Islam will be annihilated. I'm quoting Jinnah. That the Muslims will be obliterated. Obliterated is also a synonym of annihilated. So we need Pakistan to defend ourselves and Islam. This is the argument. And if you do it from morning to evening, it's bound to affect people. Because anyhow, we have to move quickly. In May 1945, at least in Europe, the Second World War ends. The Nazis and the fascists are defeated. The Allies win the war. The war in Japan, in Asia continues until August, when the bombs are, atomic bombs are thrown on Japan and it surrenders. But during this period, we find that there is an election in the UK, and Churchill, who had been sympathetic to the Muslim League, even there is some record of Churchill and Jinnah corresponding with one another, he loses the elections. The Labour Party comes to power, and the Labour Party realizes they can't hold on to India for too long, especially because the American pressure to declare India independent was immense. The British were so greatly under debt to the Americans that the salaries of their officers were being paid by the Americans. So the pressure was great. And with this arch imperialist Churchill gone, the Labour Party had to look now for a quick transfer of power. The quick transfer of power, if you want, we can go into the details. Those who have read my book know how I've brought not hidden, but printed facts into the public because they have been ignored. I've shown that the British, through their cabinet mission plan, wanted to retain control of India by insisting that it should be a weak center, just like the Muslim League wanted, that there would be 3 groups, and the groups every 10 years could decide to leave the union, or individual provinces could do it. And the princely states only surrendered their foreign affairs and defense. In the internal domain, they were free. So such an India was unacceptable, and I've argued it's not possible to hold on to such a state for too long. It's too brittle an arrangement, too precarious, it would break at any moment. So then I think the Congress at the last moment decided that they will also accept the partition, which the Muslim League had been demanding since at least 23rd, 24th March 1940. The Sikhs of Punjab 1 week later in 1940 had demanded the partition of Punjab, and on the 8th of March 1947, finally, the Congress High Command supports the Sikh demand for the partition of Punjab, but then it also demands that Bengal should be divided because there was some plan to have a greater Bengal. And Congress then joined hands with the Hindu Mahasabha to prevent that. So that's how the partition takes place. And India wins freedom, but in a fractured manner. 2 states come into being. So what is the nature of the state then? First Pakistan, and then its impact on India. I've argued in the Garrison State book and now in the Jinnah book that if you create a state in the name of a religion, and also a religion which historically has been very close to the state, and which has a comprehensive structure of laws, social practices, and many other requirements, on a daily basis, like 5 times prayers and so on. If a state is created in the name of Islam and Muslims, there is no chance that once it comes into being, you can just cast aside that basis of the state. And people quote Jinnah's 11th August speech, where for the first and last time, there is no mention of Islam. And he says that in this great state of Pakistan, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims, not in a religious sense, because that is a matter of private faith, but as citizens of the state. Well, if that is true, then why for 7 years say the Hindus and Muslims can't live together? And if they do, there will be civil war. So he was negating his own arguments, but Jinnah could do that throughout his life. Depending on the political context, he could change the position and take another one and would never accept the contradiction. And more importantly, this idea was never repeated again. I've quoted 6, 7 occasions where Jinnah brings back Islam as the basis of Pakistan. So this is a myth I've exploded as well. But Pakistan having been won in the name of Muslims, was the Muslim community homogeneous or more united than Hindus who we know were divided by caste and so many other things? No. Within the Islamic heritage, legacy, there are as many divisions as maybe the caste divisions are among Hindus. And for example, Shia Sunni faith differs on many important things. And actually they have as much conflicting views of heroes and villains as do maybe Hindus and Muslims, if you want to look at the way they look at the heroes and the villains. The Shias and Sunnis almost never share the same heroes, except one or two, that's all. Then among the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority in Pakistan, you have the Barelvis, who are into saint worship or saint veneration, let's say. Then you have the Deobandis, who are reformist, and then you have the Ahle Hadith, who are even more puritanical in their ideology. And all of them end up accusing the other of heresy and even of being non-Muslims. So though all those problems came to the front now when it was a Muslim majority state, I'm for the moment excluding East Pakistan, because East Bengal was attached to Pakistan at the very last moment. And it's only good they went out of this union. I wish it had not been in such a bloody manner. But there was no point having a state with two separate zones and no industrial base, nothing to connect them except this tenuous idea of both being Muslims. And that proved very brittle. They broke away. So if we come to West Pakistan, which is, they say, 96% Muslim, 1.6% Hindus, 1.78% Christians, the Qadiani or Ahmadi group, they count as about 300,000. The Qadianis say there are 10 millions. God knows what is the truth. And then there are maybe some other minor sects. 96% Muslims have not been able to agree on how to have a constitution which is both democratic and Islamic. And I have argued that you can either be a secular democratic state or you can be a Muslim Islamic state, which is not the same. Because if you try to combine the two, it's neither fish nor fowl. And that's the problem with the Pakistan Constitution. Many of its declarations on human rights are identical to the Constitution of India and many other parts of the world. But then there are other provisions like that Pakistani state will work for the glory of Islam, and the president and prime minister under oath have to be Muslims. Not only Muslims, they have to declare that that Prophet Muhammad was the last of the prophets, which is acceptable only to the Sunnis and Shias, who of course are the majority, but the Qadianis have a different view on this. They have been cast out as non-Muslims. And unfortunately, after the Afghan jihad and radicalization, there has been sectarian terrorism and attacks on minorities and so on. So Pakistan has become majoritarian, and in a very strong sense, extremist sense. How has that been for India? India started with its vision of a new India in which everyone, irrespective of his religion and so on, if they belong territorially to the same area, they were Indians. And the human rights and the rights granted under the Indian Constitution are fantastic. They are not bound by any religious dogma. Respect for all religions makes sense given the fact that our regions are so religion fixated. So something has to be done about that. But the secular constitution and then the governments which came into power were accused of developing vote banks and Muslim appeasement, which I've always questioned. Because if you look at the Sachar report, it said that although the Muslims were 14% of the population, they are employed less than 5% in state services. And if you look at the BJP now, it doesn't have a single elected member of parliament who's a Muslim. So with the rise of Hindu majoritarianism under the BJP, not so much under Vajpayee Saab, but under your current prime minister, there is obviously that sort of majoritarianism targeting especially Muslims. And so India is imitating what Pakistan developed much earlier. And for people like us who have always admired India and its secular institutions and values, this is a tragic day. I think I'll end here and invite questions and comments.
So, thank you, Professor Ahmed, for that illuminating talk. A bit of housekeeping before we open up the floor for questions. So I will ask one question and set the stage. After that, we'll invite questions. And if I may request all of you, if you're asking a question, could you please introduce yourself before you do so? So Professor Ahmed, one question to set the floor. This is a bit of a curveball. So I was wondering whether I should be asking this, but since you have now broached the topic twice, I think in our conversation. So as you can see on your screen, and as Professor Gangopadhyay mentioned, we are a school of energetic and young academic scholars and students here at the School of Liberal Studies at Dehradun. So this might be very relevant for us. And I'm thinking here particularly of the reception to your work when it came out, especially the Jinnah book. The criticism, or rather a critique of Aisha Jalal's work, suggesting that Jinnah was merely using Pakistan as a bargaining chip, had been building up for a while. I mean, you have been writing about it. I'm also thinking of Venkat Dhulipala writing about the new Medina. And yet, you were dismayed, but I was also surprised when Aisha Jalal's response was that because you're a political scientist, she will not engage with you. Without wading into the personal controversies around it, what I want you to sort of talk about is what are the ramifications and you know, when we think of academic disciplines, because at SOLS we really are doing transdisciplinary work, cutting across disciplines. When somebody says that, you know, we have to maintain our disciplinary frontiers, sort of guard them, what are the ramifications of such a statement and research moving ahead? If you want to sort of shed light on that.
I mean, what she said, everybody who has any sense, who has any academic background, realized that she was just finding an excuse not to be in a panel with me because she has no legs to stand in terms of the evidence which she has not given. I mean, she has to explain, okay, I can understand if she has a theory that all these speeches that Jinnah made were actually not meant to be what they suggest in the normal understanding of the English language. What does a sentence mean? What does an argument mean? He meant something else. But by ignoring all those speeches and then without giving any evidence, even one evidence, except when she comes to the cabinet mission plan. And I say, even in the cabinet mission plan, Jinnah is as responsible for its failure as was the Congress, because he accepted the cabinet mission plan, but the interim government was hardly a government in which all ministers were cooperating, one thing. Second, he said, we will not go to the Constituent Assembly to frame a constitution for a united India. Now, that was part of the cabinet mission plan. The Congress refused to accept the cabinet mission plan, as I've already explained why, and I think they were right. And it has proven right for India also, that they now have an India integrated that they can deal with in a far more effective manner without a Muslim League type of opposition all the time playing the communal card. So Aisha Jalal simply advanced a thesis by suppressing. I've said there are two sins in academic we can never forgive. The first is you write something, Rohit, and I publish it in my name. That's called plagiarism. That's easily identified. The second is that you advance a thesis by suppressing relevant material which would contradict your thesis. For me, the second is as unforgivable a crime as any. The question is, why did Aisha Jalal and nobody challenge her? Well, that's interesting. In Pakistan, they did. The mainstream Pakistani historians, reputable, good people, and I've quoted Dr. Skandar Hayat, charismatic Jinnah, Dr. Farooq Ahmed Dar, his book on Jinnah, and there are many other books where their argument is, it's a bit of it is hagiographical, that is praising Jinnah all the time. What they do is that Jinnah single-handedly defeated Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Rajendra Prasad, you name it, Maulana Azad, and so on. But they don't mention that he could do it only by siding with the British. That's missing in their way of projecting Jinnah. But insofar as Jinnah being central to the demand for partition and emphasizing and getting it done, there are no two questions. And I learned later on that in India, Professor Salil Mishra and many others had also published material, books showing that Aisha Jalal was in the wrong. But since I'm a Pakistani, I, having found that and done it in a way nobody else has done, has made it very difficult for her to face me in any panel. We have tried it many times. This is the lamest excuse is that he is a political scientist. Nobody has accepted this, and nobody with any sense, because history and politics is organically limited, connected. And what is history and what is politics? Can you divide such a line and say, well, he's a political scientist? That's not even amusing. It's ludicrous.
Thank you for that response. We'll keep trying it as well as to get both of you on the same panel. No, jokes apart, we'll take questions now. So we have one on the front bench. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ahmed. My name is Himanshu Jha, and I'm teaching here at School of Liberal Studies. I was actually intrigued. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I will not use the mic. I was actually intrigued, and you were talking about it, and it kind of brings me to the question of counterfactuals that we use in history and political science, the what if question. And so your tension between Congress and Jinnah, the British support, what if there was no British support, and what if Congress had given some kind of support to Jinnah as well? What would have happened then? So your book actually also is raising some important what if questions. My second, and I would like you to comment on it. My second question is also about, the long shadow of this on how Pakistani state developed, and Hamza Alvi has actually written about it. The bureaucratic military oligarchy. What was Jinnah's role? A kind of a tipping point, so to speak, or a critical juncture in his role as a developing a Pakistani state in any way. And third is, it was also interesting to see that Bahari Sons in Delhi actually motivated you to write this book or go in this direction. How true is that?
Well, Bahari only wanted me to write a book. I said, this is the idea I have. So that's all. That role is only to invite me to write a book for them. Choosing to write Jinnah is my decision. Apart from that, Bahari has no other role in that. So to begin with the third question, about the first question, what if this, what if that? I can spend the whole day with ifs and buts. What's the point?
Right.
All I have shown is that this is what happened, and that's what is relevant. For example, let me say like this. Did the Congress not several times approach Jinnah that let's keep India united? We give you all this, you become prime minister, you do this, you do that. And I've shown that Jinnah deliberately rejected all those proposals. For example, in January March 1940, 3 leaders met at Jinnah's place. I'll give 2 examples. And this is Dr. Ambedkar and Periyar, the Dravidian leader, and people were hoping that they will form an alternative party, national party to the Congress. After 3-4 days of negotiations, nothing came out of it. And Ambedkar apparently turned against Jinnah from that time onwards, saying that the Muslim idea of brotherhood is only for Muslims. It's not for all human beings. So these are bitter things to say. And Periyar is also on record very disappointed that Jinnah didn't want to form a party with them. Mahatma Gandhi on 16th of January wrote a letter which I've quoted. My dear Quaid-e-Azam, I address you as Quaid-e-Azam because most people are calling you by that name. I hate to call Indians by Mr., by this title. And then he goes on that you are the only leader of any stature who can actually lead Indians with an alternative democratic, a democratic alternative to the Congress. The Muslims, the Dalits, and the Dravidians think that this is an upper caste, northern Hindu, northern upper class Hindu dominated party, the Congress. You 3 form an alternative party, but for a united India. And Jinnah spurns it. So that's another example. Then during the negotiations, I've quoted from 1937 to 39, there are many offers that we are willing to accept that the Muslim League is the biggest party of the Muslims, but we can't ignore that there are other Muslim parties also who are our allies. For example, how could they disown the Khudai Khidmatgar who had stood with them all that time? What about the Jamiat-ul-Ulama-e-Hind, a pure Islamic party which stood with them? Then in the Punjab, there was the Majlis-e-Ahrar, which were steadfast supporters of the Congress. Then Ittihad party in the Sindh. How could they deny their presence? But Jinnah insisted only you have to accept that the Muslim League is a party of all Muslims. Not just that, even Subhash Chandra Bose's communication I show, he says to Subhash Chandra Bose, you have to accept that the Congress is a Hindu party. Now, is that a basis for this if and but sort of game going on? It's very clear. Jinnah had decided not to have any such compromise at all. The Second World War came in very handy, and Congress made some blunders, which I've told you. So that part, ifs and buts, don't interest me because it's a waste of time. But I'm glad you took it up because I've quoted now all the reasons why it makes no sense. What was your second question? The third one I've already answered.
Yeah, the second question about...
Yes. I remember. Yes. I've said that the destruction of democracy in Pakistan begins with Jinnah. Because he decided at the last moment to be the Governor General of Pakistan. Fine, okay. He didn't want Mountbatten, suspected him. We can agree to all that. But he could have strengthened the parliamentary system by choosing to be a titular or ceremonial head of state. He doesn't. He makes Mountbatten amend the 1935 Act and I think the 18th July 1947 Act to confer on him powers which even the viceroys never had. And with those powers, then Jinnah dismisses an elected government with a majority in the House in the Northwest Frontier province because it was a Congress Khudai Khidmatgar elected government and there was no law and order situation. So none of the preconditions for dismissing an elected government existed. But he used these powers. He even dismissed a Muslim League government, this time in Sindh, where Ayub Khodu, who was the chief minister, was opposed to Karachi being taken over by being declared federal territory. He said it's the only major city of Sindh and it should remain in Sindh. Jinnah didn't like that, threw him out, went to the East Pakistan and point blank told them, look, Urdu will be the only national language of Pakistan, full stop. And that's the beginning of the Bengali disenchantment with Pakistan. They were 55% of the population. And Bengalis are not conversant in Urdu, whereas Punjabis are, maybe Pakhtuns and Baloch also, who went to Aligarh and all, but not Bengalis. So all these things are what is known as the vice-regal system. And then Hamza Alvi's, I think that is a useful framework, bureaucratic military oligarchy. After assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan, an aristocrat from Haryana, who became prime minister on the 16th of October 1951, then the civil servants take over with the help of the army, but basically the civil servants. And they make and unmake government as they please. No elections are held. No constitution is framed until 1956. And when finally there is a constitution, it's not promulgated because there are no elections held and the military takes over. I'm not one of those who damned the military because had they not done it, Pakistan was in a very bad state, economically, and there was civil war in the air, people have said. As an 11-year-old, I remember people in Lahore jumping and dancing, Bhangra, when the military took over because there was a dearth of, I think, wheat and all. Things were really bad. And I think in East Pakistan and as well as in West Pakistan, the floods had hit people on a large scale. So things were really bad. Ayub Khan came and provided security. Of course, it means you don't have a democratic regime anymore, but an effective regime which could deliver. But then they went to war over Kashmir. And all this, I think, is Jinnah's legacy because what he taught the Pakistanis was that the Indian National Congress, later on, India were out to undo Pakistan. So even now, if you look at the debate in Pakistan, if you are critical of what is going on, they accuse you of being an Indian agent. I'm called that all the time for taking positions which are uncomfortable. And I'm not the only one. I don't even live there. I'm not a Pakistani citizen anymore. But that's the way that things are now. And the tragic part is, which you didn't take up, that almost a repeat of this, mirror image of this is happening in India. I do videos and all, and I find so many nasty comments against me coming from Indians with a Hindu name. What can I do? So that has been, it's a pathological sort of situation where people are sick, believing that the other person is just to be hated. And so Jinnah is central to that, I think.
Do we have any other questions?
Somebody else wants to go?
No, please go ahead. Introduce yourself. You don't need the mic.
I need the mic. Professor Ahmed, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, my name is Sudha. I also teach at School of Liberal Studies. I'm a historian by training. Thank you for such a provocative talk and also reminding us of certain things from the contemporary perspective. I'll begin. I have one disagreement with you and two quick questions. Give me some time to explain that. I think I do not agree with your premise on the 1942 Quit India movement, that it was a blunder by the Congress. I think Congress needed to launch such a movement because the last time India saw a mass movement was 1934. And the masses needed to be brought back on the streets. Of course, we know Gandhi's reservations against launching such a movement at such a scale right in the middle of World War II, but I'll still resist myself from calling it a blunder. Congress cannot be made responsible for getting arrested by the British government. Of course, we know that organizations like Hindu Mahasabha, RSS, and Muslim League got quite a good amount of limelight because Congress activists were arrested. But then again, calling Quit India movement as a blunder, I think is quite far-fetching. The two questions that I have is, I'll start with the third one, and then I'll move on to the second one. What is the way forward? Like, you see whatever is happening in the subcontinent in recent times, and you have shared some of your experience. What is the way forward that you see? Let me explain what I'm trying to ask here.
No, don't start commenting too much, because I have to keep in mind what you are saying, and if you keep on going on, it would be difficult to return to your main questions.
Just pose the questions. What is the way forward? How do you see?
Good. The third one. Yes, the third one.
The second one is more like a methodological question that I'm asking. How do you see using speeches? Political speeches as a source to write history or to comment on political events. I'm asking that question because you have given a different interpretation to Jinnah's 14th August speech. So in that sense, if you can comment, because we have young students sitting in the audience, it might be useful for them to understand how to use speeches in research. Yeah.
First of all, your reaction is to the Quit India movement. I can very much understand, because the way you are also trained to look at what the Indian Congress did and the leaders did, you are not able to independently assess. Look, if the whole idea was that the Quit India movement would mean the end of British rule, then it was a major failure. So if there was an objective to it, then that was defeated. That's what I'm saying. The second is, which was the unintended consequence, that when the British put the Congress in jail, for 3 years, there was no Congress alternative to what Jinnah and the Muslim League was saying. So who cashed on it? And what about the British? Their hold on India remained firm. If you don't like that, that's your own problem. But if the Quit India movement's objective was to get the British out, well, then it was a total disaster. That's what I'm saying. I look at it as a disaster because it facilitated the partition demand. For me, that's a different angle. So that's the way I look at it. The second thing is, what was your second question now? Or your first question? Well, what do we do from now onwards? Well, if you understand how things have happened and where they are leading, I think this is some sort of slow motion cultural fascism emerging in both India and Pakistan. In Pakistan, it is even has support among influential elements of the establishment. I'm sure they do have it in India as well. There is going to be a bloodbath unless the state, the civil, the law and order, the minorities are taken care of. That's it. And what was your third concern?
Using speeches.
Speeches. Can one use silence to understand the mind or the thinking of a person? That's the question. If you want to know what a person thinks and wants, you either go to his speeches, written, published, whatever. Is there any science, social science, which says silence is, unless you are a psychologist? How else are you going to substantiate a thesis, test a hypothesis, except by the words used, and the words must have a meaning, grammatical, syntax-wise, which should mean what he is trying to say, unless you have some grand conspiracy theory that this was all for the gallery and actually this is what he meant. Good. Show us if Jinnah had any such thing. I've asked Aisha Jalal, come up with something, and she can't. So this question, how to use a speech, of course you must use speeches because that's where the ideas and the arguments are presented. How well you analyze depends on your training, how much of political theory you understand, how much of, the language used you can grasp, things like this. So for me, this question is a very strange one to ask. I never met anyone who said that silence is the way you can study Gandhi or Nehru or whatever.
I did not imply that. I just wanted to get some of your own methodological.
Anyhow, I've answered your question.
Yes.
The next one.
There's one question there.
Can I get the mic?
It's on. Would you just want to shout?
Yeah. Hi, Professor. Very nice talk that you gave. It was very informative for us and was very bold, in fact, I would say. I have 2-3 questions. And if I have 2-3 questions, I'm a research scholar here. So my first question to you is, how much do you think the cause of Urdu has played a role in Jinnah's two-nation theory? And also, I would like you to comment on Sir Sayyid's view on this also, because he was the first one who sort of started the Urdu movement, so to speak. And the second question would be, how do you think, was Pakistan never a bargaining card, for Jinnah? Because initially Muslim League were not so much, they were not so much into representative democracy was not there. They were not so much represented in the center and as well as in the provinces. So do you think that it was never a bargaining card? And the third question would be, I would like to invoke Sir Sayyid's role in two-nation theory, because his role in uplifting Muslims educationally, how do you see that? Was it only restricted to that, or because I remember his 1888 speech where he sort of mentioned that both Hindus and Muslims cannot share the power. So these are the 3 questions. Thank you so much.
We begin with Sir Sayyid. Of course, Sir Sayyid is the one who takes up the cause of Urdu, and he declares that Urdu is the language of the Muslims, because the Hindi movement in UP was led by Hindus, understandably. But instead of realizing that these are 2 scripts of which the spoken language is Hindustani, of course, literary Hindi is different and literary Urdu can be also different, but the language people use everywhere. When I come to India, I never have any problem going anywhere and talking to people. The language people speak in the streets, in their shops, and it's Hindustani. So giving it a communal angle is partly a reaction, because if the Hindus was saying that Hindi should be, as Hindus, they were demanding the Hindi script, Sir Sayyid then would argue that Urdu is the language of the Muslims. I'm not defending him. I'm just trying to explain. It's not easily explained. But I would say democratically, what the Hindus, even if we say that Hindus and Hindi, they were demanding was a democratic right. 14% of the population of UP was only Muslim. Most people were Hindus, and literate Hindus were probably better trained in Hindi than in Urdu. Some were in Hindu as well. So to enable them to use their language to find, jobs in the government and so on was perfectly legitimate. So Sir Sayyid's stand was undemocratic, let me say like this. Now, secondly, which I didn't mention, in my book I quote Sir Sayyid saying, I mean, there are several things about Sir Sayyid which need to be mentioned, but first, because otherwise I'll forget. The first is that he said, and I quote Justice Muhammad Munir from Jinnah to Zia, where he quotes that Sir Sayyid said that there are two nations, Hindus and Muslims, and ultimately one will dominate the other, which means Hindus and Muslims could not together become Indians. Simple as that. The third is, once again, I call it the unintended consequence. The intended consequence of Sir Sayyid's opposition to the Indian National Congress and to, Hindus, opposition to Hindus, whatever you want to call it, was that the decline of the Ashrafia, a special group who didn't think India was their homeland. They had come as conquerors, as priests, or whatever, but they were just there because they were part of the victorious group, we can call them, okay? So when he introduced Western education, having gone to Cambridge and all, maybe even earlier, this Aligarh Anglo-Mohammedan school or college, whatever, some Muslims, either it was Muradabad, Bijnor, or some even say Bareilly, but that this happened is a fact. The city or the town, I can't remember now, they wanted to have such a system of modern education introduced in their town. And what they do is they invite Sir Sayyid to inaugurate this school. When he came to this town, they had the Muslims of that town were using the courtyard of the mosque for the school. They were poor people. And he said, who are these people who will have this Western modern education? And they said, Muslim children of shopkeepers, artisans, Ashrafia, I mean, whosoever. And Sir Sayyid was, although he was there to inaugurate and the chief guest, he was so rude, saying, look, this sort of education is only for the Ashrafia. For ordinary Muslims, you continue with the old type of mosque education, which is Arabic and a bit of classical learnings, from the past. The British, I think the Congress had demanded that the ICS exam be held in India because not all Indians could afford to go to England. And Sir Sayyid was opposed to it because, and I quote him speaking to a group of the Ashrafia, that would you, the children of Hashmis and Qurayshis and Pathans and so on, accept that the son of a Darzi, tailor, or a Bengali or whosoever gets an MA and becomes an officer, would you obey him? And they all shouted, no, never. Third, he was rabidly opposed to the education of women and said, do we want our Muslim women to become clerks in the telegraph office or nurses and so on? And then once again, that Ashrafia said no. But what is the unintended consequences? The fact is, the Ashrafia were a lost case. The 20th century was a century of the masses. So the Aligarh movement then started admitting people from all over the subcontinent. And that meant middle-class people also who sent their children. So definitely in the modern education which the Muslims acquired 70, 80 years after Raja Ram Mohan Roy had started his reform, Sir Sayyid is the one who introduced this. But for him, it was only meant for the Ashrafia. But the 20th century was the century of the masses. And so the Muslims from all over came and became educated, and maybe also became the main support of the demand for partition. This is true. In 1940, 546 election campaign, Aligarh Muslim students came to Punjab in Sheikhupura and all, saying that we know there will be no Pakistan in Aligarh, but we are here for Pakistan to come into being. They went around in the election campaign of the Muslim League. So that's it. I hope I've answered all your 3 questions.
So I think we'll have to call it a day here. Professor Ahmed, thank you very much for taking time out for this. It has been like a masterclass for all of us. Would all of you join in thanking Professor Ahmed for giving this?
I very much enjoyed talking to you, and I must thank the colleagues who answered the questions as well. And if you ever get Aisha Jalal and me on one panel, I will celebrate it by opening it with a bottle of champagne, okay? I don't think that will ever happen.
We promise you we'll try our best.
That will never happen. That will never happen. I can give you in writing. Okay?
Yeah.
But
Inshallah.
Yeah.
How do you say inshallah?
Inshallah.
इंशाल्लाह में तो जो मुसलमान इस्तेमाल करते हैं उसका मतलब होता है, आधा मतलब होता है कि हमने ये करना कुछ नहीं है। कोई मुझसे पूछे ना कि तुम आओगे कल और मैंने ना जाना हो तो मैं कहूंगा इंशाल्लाह। तो इंशाल्लाह is already half admission कि वो नहीं आएगी कभी, वो आ ही नहीं सकती यार। She will never do it.
अब इस पार्ट को एडिट किए बगैर तो नहीं आएगी। हमको इस पार्ट को एडिट करके उन्हें बुलाना है। ये पार्ट सुन लिया तो फिर कैसे आएंगे?